I thought I would just share some thoughts I had on Ilan Pappe and his three works that I've read, especially. One of these is The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, and the other two are shorter works titled The 10 Myths About Israel and A Very Short History of the Israel Palestine Conflict. Ilan Pappe is the most original, radical, and hard hitting of Israel's new historians, says Avai Shleim. And interestingly enough, he's part of a movement amongst certain Israeli historians who sought to revise and reinterpret certain key myths that had been the basis of the Zionist narrative. And they played a big part in debunking a lot of these false notions upon which the Zionist narrative is based. But Ilan Pappe goes one step further than many of these new historians, and he really takes the revisionist methodology to its rational conclusion, whereby he decisively demonstrates not only the fact that the Zionist narrative has been based on, in much, in many instances, in much of the case, to be said, that it's been based off of a lot of myths and falsehoods. Zionism has been used, or certain manifestations of it have been used, to justify ethnic cleansing and the oppression of the Palestinian people. He starts with not simply the introduction of the Zionist entity, not simply with the wars of 1948 or 1967 or later intifadas. He begins at the root of this whole movement. He begins in the 1880s when Zionism was founded. He traces the genealogy of the idea of Zionism, its initial development, counter reactions, and opposition to it, how it gradually gained dominance within the Jewish and Western worlds. And he highlights how it has eventually come to be used to justify the exploitation and oppression of the Palestinian people. He then highlights and notes the various acts of oppression committed by the Israeli entity, not merely in individual circumstances or individual events, but he links them all together in a masterful tone so that the crimes of 1967 cannot be understood without having first understood the events of 1948. And the events of 1948, for example, cannot be understood without having first understood the founding of Zionism as an ideology and its gradual increasing political influence in much of the Western world. A lot of things become apparent from Ilan Pappe's writing. The first of them is Zionism as an ideology began, obviously as this kind of nationalist movement for the Jews. It sought a homeland for the Jewish people, and it helped bring many aspects of the Jewish community into modernity. Unfortunately, when it manifested itself in the declaration, let's say, to first of all settle in Palestine, and then gradually when the British announced the creation of this state, and the British eventually left and sort of abdicated influence within the region, and eventually the United States came to be Israel's greatest ally, quote unquote, we see a trend towards greater exploitation, greater oppression, and the means fundamentally justify the ends. At the core of these acts of oppression have been this kind of ultra-nationalist ideology, which has quite frequently dehumanized Arabs and Muslims. One point to make here is that it's important to know that opposition to Zionism is not an exclusively left-wing, socialist, or Islamist phenomena. Opposition to Zionism, in fact, can be found within the Jewish community. In fact, at the very inception and during the beginning stages of Zionism, it was a fringe idea which was opposed by the majority of the Jewish community, whether it be the Orthodox Jews or the Reformist Jews or even the more secular Jews. Many of them opposed Zionism as an ideology. Zionism was seen by some as a means to bring the Jewish community into modernity, and of course by others it was seen as a useful tool to avoid the plight that the Jewish people had faced in Europe for centuries, and especially in the aftermath of the Holocaust. Yet, it of course morphed into, first of all, a force of oppression, especially on the Palestinian people, and two, it essentially, you know, it essentially allowed for good intentions when it came to protecting the Jewish people and making sure that they will not be persecuted. It became misplaced within this kind of ultra-nationalist ideology. It's also important to note the rather contradictory nature of Zionism, in that despite it being a secular nationalist ideology, it often uses religious and metaphysical claims to assert its truthfulness. It uses documents like the Bible, and it uses the Jewish religious tradition to justify its ideology and to justify many of its beliefs. Ilan Pappe decisively proves that not only are such fundamental myths, such as that Zionism is equivalent to Judaism, or that, Israel is perhaps the only, not only does he quite decisively prove these myths to be false, he also demonstrates quite actively the issues that have plagued the Palestinian people due to certain actions that the Israeli army has committed. And not to shadow over anything, the very genocidal and maniacal actions of the Israeli entity, which have forced the Palestinians off the land in many cases and committed quite very cruel acts of oppression.